This afternoon I'm going to give a little talk on the dairy goat, and as you can see from my companions here, I'm down in my barn, and this is Susie. She's one of my goats, and over here we have Cleopatra, and she's another one of my dairy goats. And with their help, I'll try and tell you a little bit about dairy goat as a source of milk and meat and cheese for the homestead. And might as well start out by saying a little bit about the history of dairy goats in Newfoundland. Any of you who can remember back, or know somebody that can remember back pre-Confederation days, knows that the dairy goat was a very popular animal in Newfoundland. There were many dairy goats scattered around the island. Some of them were pretty good milkers. A lot of them weren't very good milkers. They were either raised for meat or in some cases raised for milk. It depended on the different communities. In Logie Bay, my informants tell me that the goats were primarily kept in the barns during the winter, and then in the spring they'd let them out up on Redcliffe here, and they just shuff them out in the woods and leave them all spring and summer long. And eventually, come fall, the men would go out and hunt down some of the does and bring them in to the barn and hunt the rest of the young kids and bucks for meat. So it was primarily a sort of a part-time meat animal. But I have talked to neighbors of mine who relied on goats to a small extent for milk production. Now, after 1949, things got a little bit easier, and there was access to money and things like that, and people didn't have to go to the trouble of raising their own milk. So the home production of milk was greatly reduced, and in its place, people started to rely on canned milk. And as a result, the keeping of goats for milk production and the keeping of cows for home milk production dropped off considerably after 1949. And when I came here in 1966 up through about 1973, there were very, very few goats in the St. John's region to be had. Finally, I located one doe, which I experimented with as a milk production animal, but she turned out to be a very poor producer. From Rapunzel, I could get maybe a cup and a half of milk at a milking, and the nipples were so small that I had to do it with my thumb and forefinger. It just wasn't a suitable animal as a dairy goat. We call all the goats which have sort of run wild in Newfoundland, we call them scrub goats. Some of them may be quite good producers as far as milk production is concerned, but for the most part, they haven't been bred for milk production. Because they haven't been bred for milk production, they haven't the conformation, they haven't the strength, they haven't the size to produce a significant and worthwhile quantity of milk. Now, a goat are more or less all the same size. Because of this, they more or less eat the same amount of food. So it doesn't pay to raise a goat to get maybe 2 or 3 cups of milk a day from it, and feed it the same amount of food as you could to feed something like Susie, where you can get a gallon of milk a day from. It's just much more economical to get a good quality dairy goat. Now, in about 1974, a group of people in the St. John's region got together and formed themselves into what was called the Newfoundland Goat Cooperative. And the Newfoundland Goat Cooperative is a very informal group of people, and what we attempted to do was to get together and pool our funds and buy a herd of good quality dairy goats. These were the first dairy goats that we brought in, these white goats that originate from Switzerland, and they're called Saanen goats. And we brought in something like 9 or 10 Saanens and 3 or 4 kids and one very good quality buck. Okay, that was the start of the reintroduction of good quality dairy goats into Newfoundland. The prime mover in this enterprise was a psychologist from Memorial University by the name of Dr. John Leon.
Well, a few years ago we wanted to get some good dairy goats in, and there were a number of people who had been looking. We were really unable to find any, and a lot of the native goats are fine, healthy, sturdy goats, but if you try to milk them, you get a pint or so, and it wasn't really worth the effort. So we organized this co-op, and the idea was first to look for herds of goats on the mainland that we could bring in, which would be good dairy goats, first of all, and so that also we could buy a buck goat together, and we'd be able to provide ourselves with stud services. The first importation was of all Saanens, and that occurred, I think, about 3 years ago now. There were 14 or 15 animals in that importation. And that the group of people that got the animals then really formed the nucleus of what is now the Newfoundland Dairy Goat Co-op. Since then, the co-op has continued to bring in goats on occasion, in that way gaining new membership. It's also functioned to provide the buck services that we intended to provide at the outset. It's also organized to help its members sell kids. A lot of people around the bay and so on have wanted good dairy goats, and they've had the same difficulty we had initially. And so the co-op functions as a sort of information clearinghouse, answering letters, helping people locate kids and locate buck services.
What kind of interest is there around the island in getting good goats?
I think there's really quite a lot. It's sort of difficult to make that kind of judgment, but each year the Dairy Goat Co-op has been producing quite a number of kids, and has had really no difficulty whatsoever in selling them. In addition to selling what kids are available, usually we have a waiting list for the next spring. Just recently we've organized to bring in a herd of about 30 goats, and we placed a small ad in the Weekend Telegram, and our phone literally rang off the hook all weekend. So I think there's a very good demand for the goats. The prices are reasonably high, probably unfortunately high, but they seem to be coming down. The price right now for a good doe kid, a good grade quality goat doe kid, which should give you 3 or 4 quarts of milk a day, is probably around $100, which is a fairly high price, but then you can expect to get that money back when you breed her the spring of the first year.
Now, what constitutes a good dairy goat? Does it have to be a purebred or any specific breed?
Well, the only way to judge a dairy goat is on the amount of milk you get. You can judge the milk in 2 ways, or you have to take 2 factors into account. One is the amount you get on any given day. Most of the dairy goats in the Dairy Goat Co-op are producing something on the order of 3 or 4 quarts at the start of a lactation, which is a really fine figure. That's not an average for the whole lactation. Usually you try and milk a dairy goat for 10 full months, and by the end of this lactation they go down to probably 2 quarts a day or something like that, and then you dry them off and prepare them for the next skidding. So over a whole lactation, you probably average something very near 3 quarts a day, and that's sort of the typical figure, I think, of the goats that we've been managing.
Why do you like goats? Why have you, for instance, decided to have a dairy goat instead of a cow? What particular advantages are there about the goat?
Well, we have 4 goats in my family. We use a lot of milk. We make cheese and ice cream and yogurt and so on. So I suppose we use enough milk that it would warrant having a cow. For most people, I think the goat comes in a really economic unit. It's sort of a household-sized milk producer. Families can manage 3 to 4 quarts of milk a day, but they couldn't manage 4 or 5 gallons of milk a day. But for me, the reason I have goats, even though I could probably have a cow, is they're just a very social animal. I've never been particularly fond of cows, or I've never been able to see any emotional attachment on either side when I've been around cows. But goats are very dog-like in their behavior, and I think they're as good a pet for children as is a dog. They like to play. They recognize people individually. They have a large number of attachment behaviors that are quite endearing. And they're just a very friendly, nice kind of animal to be around.
If you're interested in raising goats, the first thing that you're going to have to do is to get some information on it. You're going to have to read some books and read up about the subject, because it would be a real crime to get a good quality dairy animal like this and not know what you're doing and pay a lot of money. This is a valuable animal. It cost me $300 to bring it in from Ontario. That was 3 years ago. To spend a lot of money on a good quality animal and then not know how to raise it, how to take care of it, how to feed it, how to breed it and kid it, and then eventually milk it. So it's very important that you do some reading on the subject. And the 2 books which I would suggest to you is a book by Ballinger, Jerome Ballinger. This is a book on raising a small livestock. This covers chickens and goats and pigs and geese and turkeys and a variety of small stock. But it does have a fairly good chapter on goats. Now, Ballinger has also written a book just on the dairy goat. Another book which I particularly like, which is a really very complete and thorough look at dairy goats, is this by David Mackenzie called Goat Husbandry. You can buy all these books by ordering them through the book corner. Now, the first thing you have to think about when keeping a goat is you have to think about housing it. You need to have a barn or a shed or something like that to keep your goat. And this doesn't have to be a very exotic or very fancy structure. You need to have it sufficiently large. It doesn't have to be heated, but you don't want it to be drafty. You want it to be nice and airy. You don't want it to be drafty. You need sufficient space. You need, each goat maybe needs a pen at least 5 feet by 5 feet. If you can give them a little more space, that would be even better. You need light. You need some windows so that they can see what they're doing and walk around. You don't want to keep them in a dark, dank garage. During the summer, you want them to have access from this barn out onto the pasture or out into a fenced-in pen area. And during the winter, you want them enclosed out of the snow. But I want to emphasize again that during the winter, these are very hardy creatures. You don't have to heat the barn at all. I'm sitting in this barn. It's probably somewhat below freezing this afternoon. But these animals can take very, very cold weather. As long as it's not drafty, they're quite happy. Now, you might notice that these goats are bedded on hay and leaves. Now, there are two ways to bed a goat. You can either clean bed them or you can deep bed them. I prefer the deep bedding approach. If you're going to clean bed them, you have a stall with preferably a cement or wooden floor, and each morning you come in, you sweep it out and you clean it out, and this keeps them nice and clean. Goats, by the way, are one of the cleanest animals there are. Extremely clean, extremely tidy, extremely neat animals. Goats never smell bad, at least the female dairy goat doesn't smell bad. The buck smells very bad, and I'll talk about that later on. Now, instead of clean bedding, I use what's known as the deep litter method. In the deep litter method, I simply let the material accumulate on the floor all during the winter and spring. I generally clean out this barn about once or twice a year. That sounds kind of dirty, but if you look around, it really isn't. There's a lot of hay lying around, there's some leaves lying around. When they manure or when they urinate, it goes down and gets lost in the litter. And they keep themselves very clean on this kind of bedding. The reason all the hay is on the floor is because goats are terribly fussy and wasteful feeders. Over here, I've got a feeding trough. From the other side of this fence, I put in loads of hay and I put in loads of leaves, and the goats put their head through these little holes and they pull out the leaves and they pull out the hay, and about half of it they eat and about half of it they drop on the ground. And this is very wasteful. If you're considering buying all your hay, if you make your hay, then the hay isn't wasted, because eventually this is going to be dug up and put back on the garden. So it'll all be used eventually. By deep bedding, they have a nice, soft, relatively warm surface to walk on during the winter. When it comes to feeding a goat, you have to consider whether you're talking about the winter or the summer. Different requirements in the two different seasons. Okay, now it's in the middle of winter, and you need two principal constituents for goat feed. You need something with lots of bulk. You need hay or leaves or something like this, something which is going to fill the goat up. The goat has an enormous stomach capacity, and in order for it to get its energy and to get the heat that it needs to maintain itself, it's got to have its gut stuffed right full of some bulky material like hay or leaves. If you want to add a few little tidbits to the diet during the winter, offer it some fir boughs. Very fond of fir boughs, or if you're cutting fence posts for use in the next spring, just bring a couple of fence posts in and stick them up against the side of the wall, and she'll chew all the bark off the fence post. Beside this bulky material, you need something that's going to supply the nutrients. So you've got to supply them with some kind of feed concentrate. For my dairy goats, I give them about half a gallon. I give each animal about half a gallon of dairy feed per day. And you should be able to get dairy feed at your local feed store. During the summer, you want to put your goat out to pasture. Goats will pasture in fairly rough areas. They will also browse. Browsing means that they like to reach up and feed off of trees. During the summer, my goats don't feed on evergreens very much. They prefer alder and alder and birch and various trees like this. Apparently, it's not too good an idea to let your animals feed on the wild cherry. There's supposed to be some toxic products in that. Another thing that I've found my goats get very sick on is goldenrod. And another thing that goats get extremely sick on is something called lambskill. When you put your animals out to browse during the summer, you're going to find that the first place they're going to head for is either the vegetable garden or the flower garden or your most treasured shrubs. This is where they'll aim first thing off. So goats get a reputation of being a very destructive animal. They're not destructive, they're just hungry. So if you're going to keep a goat and you're not going to keep it tied up all summer, it's a crime to keep a goat tied up, you've got to be prepared to make some very good fencing for it. If you're going to fence in a goat, you've got to think in terms of at least a 4-foot high fence. Some goats will even jump a 4-foot fence. But these ones are kept in by a 4-foot fence. Don't, for goodness sake, make this fence out of barbed wire. Make it out of block wire that used to keep pigs and cattle in or something. Well, if your goat goes over a barbed wire fence and catches her udder in it, there's not going to be much of a goat left for you. All right. Now, if you're going to get a goat, the prime thing you want, of course, is the milk. So you want to know how to go about the whole milking process. Now, one thing which is very obvious to me, which apparently isn't very obvious to everybody else, that in order to produce milk, a goat has to produce a kid. So before you can have a kid, you have to get your goat bred. And in order to have it bred, you have to take it to the local buck. Now, hopefully, for your sake, you won't be the one who's keeping the local buck, because bucks tend to be very large, very obnoxious, and very smelly. And if you're lucky enough that one of your neighbors has a buck, you're in good shape. Otherwise, you may have to keep a buck of your own. If it is necessary for you to keep a buck, or if you have quite a large number of goats, you may decide you want to keep your own buck. In this case, make sure that you house your buck in a separate area from the does. Otherwise, the odor from the buck is transferred to the does and thence to the milk. And buck odor is not very pleasant. Okay, most of the time you breed dairy goats sometime in the fall. I've bred mine anywhere from September on up through January. After breeding, you count forward about 155 days, something like 5 months. That is the calculated time of parturition or birth. Now, the whole topic of birthing a goat is, for the first couple of times, sort of a very nerve-wracking kind of experience. I've sat up overnight with my does. Looking back on it, I probably didn't have to. They probably could have looked after themselves very well. But it was a really nice, enjoyable kind of an experience. And if they had have gotten into any trouble, I could have provided her with some help. Now, I can't go into all the trials and tribulations that you might have in birthing your goat. So you're going to have to go to the books, and you're going to have to read about the details from the books. You can tell when your goat is about to produce because her udder will start to fill out and get engorged, and there are a variety of other signs. As soon as the udder gets engorged and filled out, you can figure that she's going to produce her kid within the next 3 days to a week. Okay, there are two approaches to looking after newly born goat kids. One, you can let the mother lick her off, dry the kid off. The kid will start feeding immediately, and from then on you leave the kid with the mother on a more or less continuous basis for the next 2 months or so. The second approach of raising kids is to immediately remove her from the mother at birth. You don't even let the mother lick her off. You remove her, dry her, clean her, and take her completely away from the mother. We take her up to the kitchen. Now, this seems like a cruel and heartless thing to do, but there's a good purpose for it. If you want the goat to provide milk for you and not provide all the milk for the kid, then the only way to ensure this is for you to do the milking and not have the kid do the milking. If you leave the kid with the mother will produce sufficient milk from the kid and not produce any more. But if you remove the kid from the mother and you milk the doe out twice a day, then she'll produce a much larger quantity of milk. Now, it's very important to remember that the first milk is a thick, sticky, yellowish material called the colostrum. The first milk is extremely important, and the kid must have this first meal. This first colostrum is chock-a-block full of antibodies, and it will protect the young kid from many diseases that it might succumb to if it didn't have this material. So even if you take the kid away from the mother, the first milkings you've got to save and put aside, and then you feed the kid either from a baby bottle, or some kids will learn to drink immediately from a dish. So if you've taken the kid away, it's going to be your responsibility from now on to feed the kid for about 2 months. At first you'll have to feed her 3 or 4 times a day, and then you can get it down to about twice a day feeding. Again, go to the books to find out the quantities. Now, if you're lucky, you'll have doe kids. Usually, by the way, a goat like this will produce twins. Occasionally, they'll produce triplets. Even more occasionally, they'll produce 4. Now, if you're lucky, you'll have doe kids. Doe kids are usually considerably more valuable than buck kids, unless you're lucky enough to have an extremely well-formed and well-bred buck kid. In that case, you may be able to sell it to somebody for a stud buck. But most buck kids end up in the soup pot. So they don't tend to have the value of doe kids. Now, when the kids are produced, Susie, don't eat my notes, please. When the kids are produced, you have to do a number of early operations on them. If there are buck kids and you're planning to raise them for meat, it would be a good idea to castrate them very early. In the first 2 or 3 days, castrate the buck kids, and then eventually the meat will taste much better than if you leave them as whole animals. Another thing which you may have to do for both males and females is dehorning. Dehorning is a rather nasty operation which has to be done. If you leave a goat with her horns, and you can tell if a kid is going to have horns, feel on the top of the head, and if it's got little sharp lumps about the size of a pea, she is going to produce horns. If she's completely smooth on the top of the head, then you're lucky, she's hornless. But people say, well, it's natural for them to have horns, we should leave them with their horns on, why take them off? And the problem is that goats grow horns because they like to use them for butting. And you have 3 or 4 goats in a pen, they'll be whacking away at each other all the time. Now if they've got horns, they're going to hurt each other. Or one goat with a set of horns and other goats without horns, it's just going to be a mess. And if you try and dehorn later on in life, you're going to be very unhappy because it's a really hideous operation. But if you do it early, in the first 3 or 4 days of the kid's life, it's fast and quick and not very nasty. What I have here is a piece of iron rod about 3/4 of an inch in diameter. In the end of the piece of rod, I've drilled about a 1/4 inch hole, 1/4 inch deep. This hole is the hole that you're going to put down over the tip of the horn on the head of the baby goat. What we do now is I've got on this piece of metal is stuck into just an ordinary bit of conduit or pipe so that it doesn't get hot, so you can handle the thing. What we're going to do now is put this piece of metal into the fire and leave it there till it gets hot enough so that in a darkened room it's glowing a dull red. As soon as it's hot enough to glow a dull red, then we'll take it over and disbud the kid. Okay, now we're going to wrap up the goat so that you can't move around. Now you'll notice that Fred has a leather glove on and I got a leather glove, just so we don't burn ourselves. I'm going to go get the iron. Bring out the iron. Should be hot enough to singe paper. Take the goat and 1,002, 1,003, 1,004, 1,005, 1,006, 1,007, 1,008, 1,009, 1,010. That ought to come off and finish up the job. Okay. There's a girl.
Come on, here. What's that? Not used to it cold, are you?
Okay, we'll just finish it up and make it all right. Okay, wash her off a bit. Get her udder nice and clean. Take a paper towel and dry her off. Now when you clean a goat's udder off, you always want to use nice warm water. And this has the effect of stimulating the goat to let down her milk. If you don't wash her off, with warm water, she won't let down the milk. What the warm water is simulating is the kid suckling. When you're milking, you take your thumb and forefinger and you close off the teat. Close it off really tight, and then with the rest of your fingers you squeeze out the milk. See that? Don't be afraid of hurting. Go on, Goose. Don't be afraid of hurting the goat. You won't hurt her. That's what they're designed for. The kid would give a lot more of a squeeze than you will. And milking is a process which is easy enough once you get used to it. First and foremost, you have to keep the goat happy. You talk to her, you're a good singer, you sing her a little song, you jolly her along, and you keep her nice and calm and content. That's the first thing about getting good supply of milk. The second thing is you want to milk fast. You don't want to doodle along, you want to get down to the job and do it as fast as you can. What you're aiming for is a continuous flow of milk. Hear that? Going in almost continuously. We're starting to get to the end of the milking. Her udder is starting to get loose and flaccid, and she doesn't have a whole lot more milk left in her. Each time you milk, and you have to milk twice a day, you want to get all the milk out of her you can. So you give the udder a good massaging towards the end. That gets down the last of the milk. That'll get out some more milk. You get that down. Hey, I think that's all the milk. And then you give her another little massage. She really likes this. Give her another little massage, and there's some more milk come down. There you go. That's about 2 quarts of milk. Now, goats, like cows and sheep, have 2 fingers on their feet, and these are covered with the hoof, which is equivalent to our fingernail. And like our fingernails, these hooves continuously grow throughout life. Now, in the wild condition, goats would live in somewhat rocky kind of conditions, and they'd be wearing down their feet continuously. But under the softer conditions that they exist in here, the fingernails or the toenails tend to overgrow. So every once in a while you have to hair their feet back. Now you can take a look at this and you see that this is long and there's a lot of manure and goo down in there, and that leads to a bad condition where they're not walking properly on their feet, and also their feet are continuously wet, which would cause the feet to rot. So you take a knife and you trim the toes. They don't mind it too much. They're not overly enthusiastic about it, but once they get used to the idea, they're all right. And just trim it down till you don't want to. If it starts to look red, you're getting too far, eh? You keep it down, you get it right down so that there's no groove in there for the manure to accumulate in. That's about right. Take a look at this one. See how badly overgrown this foot is? If you don't do it, the goat will be extremely uncomfortable, and it sort of tends to walk back on its heel, and eventually it'll go lame. Come on, Cleo. Stay still now. Stay still, Cleo. Goats tend to be extremely healthy creatures as long as they're well fed and well housed. However, naturally they do suffer from some diseases, and they tend to suffer from the same diseases that sheep suffer from. Things like blackleg, pulpy kidney, and a variety of other diseases. If you go to your local vet and ask him for the injections which he would advise sheep farmers to give their sheep, and we inject our animals about once a year to protect them from these various infectious diseases. We tend to give them the injections in the spring after they've kidded. And at the same time, we can give the injections to the kids. About once or twice a year, we tend to feed our goats tramisol, which is a worming compound. This is a material which will flush any worms which they've tended to accumulate over the year out of their gut. Now, goats are in many parts of the world considered to be a great delicacy as far as meat is concerned. Goat meat tends to taste something like a mixture between lamb and venison or deer. I've tasted it and it's extremely good. I'm not particularly partial to slaughtering goats, because if you keep goats for a little while, you find that you get extremely attached to them, and it's very hard to put a gun to their heads and kill them. However, if you're a little more thick-skinned than I am, then I suggest that you use your extra bucks and very old does, I suppose, for meat production. And you'd follow the same kind of approach as you would if you were slaughtering lambs. since I can't bring myself to killing goats, I've adopted the following procedure if I find that I've got buck kids. Buck kids are good for nothing unless they're good for meat. So if you don't want to eat your buck kids, either give them away to somebody else to raise or kill them immediately at birth, because they're just going to be an expensive burden, and if they're not going to produce anything, it probably isn't worthwhile rearing them up. May be able to sell it to somebody for a stud buck. But most buck kids end up in the soup pot, so they don't tend to have the value of doe kids. Now, when the kids are produced, Susie, don't eat my notes, please. When the kids are produced, you have to do a number of early operations on them. If there are buck kids and you're planning